Okay, welcome everyone to the University of Texas Energy Symposium for today, April 18th, 2023. So this is the final energy symposium of the spring 2023 semester. And there's no better way to close out our semester than have one of our deans here for this last talk of the year. So today, it's a pleasure to have Dean of the LBJ School of Public Affairs, J.R. DeShazo, speaking to us about climate risks. And well, this is not your title. That's not your title.
Maybe the next slide.
Yeah, it's not your title. So let's go a little background over there. He's going to talk to us about electric vehicles and policy of electric vehicles and employment and wages and job creation in the electric vehicle market. So apologies for that. So JR is the 12th Dean of the LBJ School of Public Affairs here at UT Austin, and he served as the founding director of UCLA's Luskin Center for Innovation. It's one of the nation's leading environmental policy research centers. He's been here for how long? 2 years? 2 football seasons. Okay. Measured in football seasons here. He's been here for 2 football seasons. He's a distinguished scholar focusing on clean technology policies, policy design to enhance environmental equity, methods for valuing changes in environmental quality and performance of public agencies. So his talk today is on understanding the impact on the economy and policy relevant impacts of electric vehicle adoption. So some of this I think will be focused on the California experience. So California's transportation sector is projected to create over 7.3 million full-time equivalent job years of employment over the next 25 years in terms of meeting carbon neutrality. A lot of these will be part of new kinds of sectors, such as refueling infrastructure and electricity as a transportation fuel for vehicles. A lot of this will be spurred within industries and occupations that currently offer high-quality jobs in terms of unionization, wages, benefits that are accessible without necessarily getting bachelor's degree. So this influx of new jobs for zero-emission vehicle sectors must be considered alongside the accompanying substantial decline in jobs related to the fossil fuel internal combustion engine vehicles. A decline caused by several zero-emission vehicle trends, which are beneficial to California and perhaps people everywhere. I guess maybe we can discuss the difference between California and Texas and other places. But with that said, I'm now going to switch over the presentation and hand it over to Dean DeShazo to discuss with us clean vehicle policies. So let's welcome Dean DeShazo here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. All right. Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I want to make this as conversational as possible so that you get as much out of it as you possibly can. That's the whole purpose of being here today. I want to acknowledge Daniel Kofi, who's a co-author, and David Kung, who's also a co-author on the work that I'm going to be presenting. And I want to spend a few minutes. Okay. So do I just doing the right click and it's.
Oh, what if you want to advance?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that one.
Yeah. All right. Okay.
There we go. Okay. All right. So I want to give you an introduction. How many of you guys have ever read a job creation study for any kind of a clean energy or clean technology that's been introduced? We have, okay. So I'm going to assume we have sort of a beginner's audience on this. And that's a good thing, because I think some of the issues that go into thinking about how you do a job creation study are really important. So very frequently, you'll see requests mostly from the federal government, state governors, the Department of Energy, and they'll want to know if we implement 12,000 megawatts of distributed solar, how many jobs are going to be created in West Texas? Or if we implement a water recycling program in Los Angeles or in San Antonio, how many new jobs are going to be created? If we implement new technology standards for refrigerators, how many new jobs are going to be created, right? And so these are the kinds of questions that you'll get mostly from policymakers. And I want to talk a little bit about how policymakers, why they're interested in this question. And so, you know, when we think about job creation studies for clean technology, there are really three motivations. So the first motivation is that an elected official who cares about employment in their jurisdiction wants to know what the impacts of that proposed technology or policy is going to be for folks in their district, right? So they're thinking, how many more jobs are there going to be because of this policy change, right? So that's what they're motivated to do. There is a second motivation, which is the focus on what has come to be known as a just transition. Introducing, as we're going to talk about in the case of California, a set of policies that are meant to eliminate all internal combustion engine vehicles by 2040 is going to mean that many workers who extract oil and gas, who transport it, who refine it, who produce fossil fuel combustion-based vehicles are going to have to transition out of their current work into other work or retire and leave the workforce. So this focus on a just transition raises the question, well, what happens to those workers who are going to be displaced or dislocated? And then second, for the new technologies that are being created, in this case, electric and hydrogen-based transportation opportunities, how well paying are those jobs going to be, right? So the second question is really about the welfare losses associated with job disruption and dislocation. And for the new jobs created, how good are those jobs, right? If you were a union boss, you might think, well, what are the benefits? What are the wages going to be of these new jobs? So that's the second motivation for caring about job creation. The third motivation is when the state of California is thinking about a policy that's going to affect hundreds of thousands of jobs over a 25-year period, we may want to ask the question, are we training people to do the new jobs that are going to emerge and be needed, right? So our community colleges, our trade associations, our universities, are they producing a workforce that aligns with the job needs that these new technologies are going to have? And just for context, you may be aware that when I did this study in 2020, basically 2021, we weren't sure if the state of how serious the state of California was going to be. Since then, the state of California has set a target date to ban the sale of new combustion engines by 2035. So this study is going to assume that all combustion vehicles are phase out by 2045. So 10 years kind of later. So that's the scenario. Let me just pause and see if you guys have any questions about the kind of the why you would want to do a job creation study around the new technology. Yeah.
This is more like broad, I guess, but there's been a large criticism of job creation programs broadly as not necessarily delivering upon the numbers greater than being temporary.
So could you say it a little bit louder?
There's been pretty big criticism of job creation programs for essentially being either temporary jobs or not fully delivering on the jobs that they've been expected to deliver. Right. So economists, and I'm trained as an economist, tend to hate to do job creation studies. We really don't like to do them. To do them well and think about net job creation, you have to kind of do it in a general equilibrium framework, and very few people try and ever do that in reality because it's hard to do, and to make so many assumptions is not super trustworthy in and of itself. What I'm going to suggest is that the main benefits of doing the job creation studies are to understand changes in occupations and how many people are in different occupations and what the time pattern of employment is going to be
And you're going to see I'm going to have some critiques really myself of doing job creation studies. I'm going to get to those in just a second before I give you this case study for California. But the other criticism is typically that we're doing these studies not comparing them to a status quo policy, right? So in this case, we're assuming that the policy has been decided, and in fact, we're not even going to worry about policies. We're going to assume, like a lot of engineers do, but we're just going to phase them all out. And we're asking, what are the employment consequences of phasing them all out? Your question suggests, well, you can't just make that assumption. You have to say, well, what are the policies that are going to accomplish that, and how effective are those policies, right? And at the LBJ school, that's basically what we spend a lot of time focused on, is the effectiveness of the policies. In this analysis, we're going to assume that the policies are effective. And again, one of the things that you'll see as you move out into the professional world is the engineering estimates for the environmental effectiveness of energy efficiency technologies and weatherization are often systematically overestimated, right? And so a lot of these, a lot of what we don't take into account for is imperfections in how policies are implemented, and the fact that people behave in ways that we don't always anticipate, right? But that's a good point. Any other questions on the motivation before I move on? Okay. So the hardest part of doing these kinds of studies, and let me kind of take you through the basic method that is very, very, very commonly used. The first is you have to create a transition scenario, and that's what I was just referring to. And in this case, we're assuming that we're taking 2019 as our base year in California, and we're asking, if we phase all internal combustion engines out by 2045, what are the impacts going to be on employment? In this case, we're going to look every 5 years throughout that period. And we really, you're going to see in just a minute, you have to kind of dig deep into kind of different economic sectors to do this well. But the hardest thing to do is you've got this transition scenario, and I'm going to talk about the transportation fuel supply chain. I'm going to talk about the supply chain associated with making fossil fuel and zero emission vehicles. And then I'm going to talk about maintenance and transportation services. Those are all the sectors that are going to be impacted by this policy. And what you essentially have to do is, for any given scenario that you're going to look at, you have to figure out what the changes in future spending or expenditures are going to be. And it's going to turn out to be, that's going to be the most challenging thing to do, is how our firms and local governments and households spending behavior are going to change. Because that's what drives the job creation. If you get that wrong, you should just stop right there, because everything else you're going to do is going to be incorrect. And so that's really the most difficult. What you do once you have your future expenditures, you can then plug them into some standard models. There's a RIMI model, there's an in-plan model. And what that does is it forecasts the impacts of these changes in spending on occupations. So you can figure out, if we're spending a lot less on gas and oil, and we're spending more on electricity, what's that going to do to employment in oil and gas, and what's that going to do to employment in the electricity sector, right? So that's in a very aggregate way. Those are the steps in the process, right? When I talked about estimating expenditures being difficult, you have to know, what are the prices of fuel going to be over the next 25 years? What are the prices of all the vehicles in the fleets going to be for both fossil fuel and for electricity? What are the prices for heavy duty and medium duty? What's the cost of wages for labor? The folks that are going to drive these vehicles? you're going to see a lot of, in the oil and gas, a lot of what you lose are truck drivers who move oil and gas around in vehicles. And so you really have to know the price of everything that you're interested in going forward. And that's hard to do, right? That's hard to forecast. But that's not really the hardest part of this whole exercise. One of the challenges that we face, and if you remember, the first motivation is policymakers care about jobs and job creation. They feel like they're going to get reelected if there are more jobs in their districts, right? And anyone that's taken an economics class has probably heard of this thing called labor productivity. Labor productivity is usually positive. Over time, labor is getting more and more productive, which means for any fixed amount of output, you need less labor to produce that fixed amount of output year after year after year, right? We're getting more efficient in how we combine capital and labor together to produce things, right? So again, holding output could be number of vehicles fixed. You need fewer workers because the economy is figuring out how to educate them more effectively, how to have them use tools and other technology more effectively. So labor productivity is positive and it stays positive over time. What that means is that the amount of labor in the fossil fuel transportation sector is declining over time for a fixed amount of output. The same is true for the electric vehicles or the zero emission vehicle sector. Labor and employment in both of these sectors is declining over time. That's not what the policymakers want to hear. They want to hear that you're going to have fewer people employed in any case in the transportation sectors, right? So already kind of as a policy analyst, you've got a challenging message to convey to folks because almost never is it the case that the total number of jobs goes up in a sector. It might go up in the beginning, but let me ask you this question. If we want to make the argument, or if we believe that electric vehicles are going to be more cost effective for consumers in the long term compared to fossil fuels, let's just assume that is true for a minute. Can it be true that the total number of workers in the electric vehicle sector can be larger than the fossil fuel sector? What would have to be true for that to happen? It'd have to be a lot more low wage workers, right? But the reality is going to be that if it's better for consumers and for firms, it's probably because there's less embodied labor in the vehicles and the fuel and things like that. And that's what makes it cheaper. That's what makes it more cost effective, right? And so what the politicians want, which is lots of employment, they don't like unemployment. And what we know in terms of what firms in the economy are trying to do is they're trying to use less and less labor. So that's one challenge. One of the things that comes out of that is the questions, well, how much less labor is going to be needed to produce these zero emission vehicles and fuels? What occupations are going to be winners? What occupations are going to be losers? And what are the wage levels going to be, right? Getting back to this idea of a just transition. And so those are questions that we can answer in our simulation, right? That's actually something that we're going to be able to speak to. And I'll show you, I mean, I have an estimate of how much less, how many workers, it was 7.3 job years over 25 years that were required to move us to a zero emission vehicle a world in California. We could do the same thing for the fossil fuel sector and figure out, without any of these policies, how much smaller would the fossil fuel sector be, right? And we could compare those two if we wanted. So we can do those kind of relative comparisons. So one thing is just communicating the fact that labor productivity is positive, and breaking the news to these elected officials, you're not going to see job growth in your districts. Even if you don't make this transition, you're going to see fewer jobs created because we're using labor more efficiently. The second challenge is kind of predicting spending over time, right? And what makes that difficult is mostly we're really, really bad as economists at predicting innovation, right? I suspect many of you guys are engineers. You're thinking, how am I going to innovate? What companies can I form that will create new products, right? There's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of noise in where innovations are going to happen and how effective they're going to be, right? And yet we can look back over the last 10 years and we can see some areas where there's surprising amounts of innovation, right? We see batteries, the cost of batteries declining dramatically. We see the cost of solar panels declining dramatically. We don't see the efficiency of combustion fuel engines declining as much as we would have expected, right? So in some places we see innovation happening, in other places we don't see it happening. We're not very good at predicting yet where innovation happens and where it doesn't, right? And so, and we're looking at a 25-year horizon. So, trying to figure out, assuming sort of a reasonable rate of innovation is a tricky thing to do. Okay. And then, well, let me just pause and see if you guys have any questions on what I've said so far. Yeah.
There's one clarification online, at least in terms of your study.
Yeah.
Is it phasing out purchase of new internal combustion engines by 2045 or phasing out use of internal combustion engines by 2045?
It's phasing out, it's moving to 100% sales by 2045. So in the back of that question is the fact that there's a used car fleet, which will persist over time. And that the size of that used car fleet and what the mix between electric vehicles and fossil fuel vehicles are really is going to depend on the cost and the performance of electric versus fossil fuel. So if you're going to see people retire fossil fuel vehicles if electric vehicles are cheaper or they perform better, right? And it's really hard for the government right now, given the policies that it has to regulate that market for used vehicles. Yeah. Okay, so let me show you. Let me talk a little bit about the details of this study, right? So we're going to have three supply chains. The biggest one is going to be the fuel supply chain. The second one is going to be the automobile or the vehicle supply chain. And then the third one will be transportation services. What we are essentially doing is we're asking, how does the set of policies and the phase out of fossil fuel vehicles affect the demand for transportation fuels? And what you can see here is we've got an upstream, a midstream, and a downstream, right? And so for the and each one of these, the reason we're focusing on this is each segment of this supply chain is going to have a set of occupations that are going to be impacted. And we want to ask ourselves, how many people, how many workers are in each of these occupations? What are their wages? Where are they going to go? And so on and so forth on the fossil fuel side. So there's crude oil and gas extraction. There's the process and refining of raw inputs. And then downstream, which is where most of the labor is in the supply chain, is the fleet of truck drivers and the gas station operators. And I won't show you these numbers because there could be just tons of numbers in this study if you wanted to see them, but about 80% of the employment in the fossil fuel supply chain is distributing fuel and retailing fuel. That's where almost all the workers are. And it's because we've gotten to a point on extraction and refining where it's super, 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 super capital intensive. You don't need a lot of workers to run a refinery. You don't need a lot of workers to run a pumping operation. You do still need a lot of workers to run your retail stores and drive your fuel around, transport it. And then on the other side, we're talking about a policy that is going to be increasing the demand for electricity as a transportation fuel. And so that gets us into an upstream, a midstream, and a downstream as well. So upstream, we have power generation, right? That's going to be coal, geothermal. Well, it's going to be coal, natural gas, geothermal, and then a bunch of renewables, right? And that has to be transmitted to where it's going to be consumed. So we have these high voltage currents, and then we have the distribution, the sort of distribution network that the utility is typically going to manage, right? With all of the retail services that they have to offer to interact with consumers and deliver that power to households and businesses. And it's probably worth pointing out that the electricity sector is very well organized. There are utilities that are responsible already for the power generation and the transmission and delivering this power to consumers. And so to kind of highlight one of the big differences that we're going to see is one of the concerns around the just transition and making sure that as we get into clean energy, that it's not bad for workers is this question of, well, how many more workers are we going to need to produce the electricity, the clean electricity that we are going to be demanding? And most utilities are unionized, so they're making wages of anywhere between a third to 2 times the sort of non-unionized wage, and so a lot of the wage benefits really of transitioning to clean energy or clean electricity and using more of it in the transportation sector are going to accrue to those workers, right? Just kind of looking ahead. Let me pause here on the supply chain for fuels and see if you guys have questions. I'm going to, show you some results in just a minute, but I want to set up each of the supply chains before I sort of show you results. Yeah.
There should still be some crude oil and gas extraction for power generation, right?
There will be some for power generation. There'll be some for aviation. There'll be some for plastics and other industrial products. So even in California, and I think California might be the second or fourth largest state, producer state, the assumption is there would still be extraction happening. Yeah.
Are you including the minerals which are mined for creating all the transmission lines like copper? Yeah, some other ones in the wind turbines.
So are we going to be accounting for the materials that, yes. Yeah, so that's there'll be in that in-plan model at the end, there'll be sort of the employment implications of having to produce all of those raw materials and manufacturing those components and things like that. Yeah. Yeah.
In the upstream, do they incorporate the amount of the jobs that'll be created or the amount of power generation capacity that'll have to be increased to charge 100% EVs by 2040?
Yeah.
Because that would offset maybe the loss of jobs.
Yeah, that's exactly what the model is doing, is how much more power are we going to need, and what's the change in the labor force going to be associated with that. Now, there are a lot of important questions here, right? One of the important questions is around transmission, and the reason transmission is so important over here is because anybody have a guess at night in Austin, what's the utilization capacity of the power grid for Austin Energy? Let's say between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. Anybody have an idea? Do you have an idea?
You mean the capacity of the grid to deliver peak power
No, what's the capacity utilization?
of power plants?
Power plants would be fine, yeah.
Which day?
Well, I'm interested in the sort of how much overhead is there in the transmission and distribution system?
2.5 times.
Right. So basically, it's very, very underutilized in the middle of the night, right? So if you could simply build more generation, you might not need to expand your transmission and distribution system because everyone charges at night, right? And one of the questions that we have to face in modeling this is, well, who's going to charge at night? Who's going to charge during the day? If you've got municipal bus operators, they're not going to charge at night. Well, they charge at night, but they're going to have to recharge during the day. So you have to make a lot of assumptions about charging behavior, right? To figure out, do I need to upgrade my transmission and distribution system, or do I just need to upgrade my generation capacity? And then, there are other, one of the things that we're going to focus on a lot down here is everybody thinks, oh, there are going to be lots of jobs created because we have to build more charging stations, right? Yeah.
And then is hydrogen playing any part in the?
Yes, it does.
uh,
So in the model that we're working off of, hydrogen is used for all heavy duty vehicles and some mid-size trucks too. Yeah. Because right now, except despite Tesla's promises, we don't yet have heavy duty trucks that are electric that can do the job. Any other questions before I move on? Okay. So then we have the vehicle supply chain. And what's interesting is when we started this work, none of the automakers had really drank the EV Kool-Aid yet. But over the last 2 years, there has been, I started doing this work in 2010. When Tesla first launched its vehicle, and then Nissan launched a vehicle in 2011, and then by 2015 we had maybe 35 models. By the late teens we had maybe 60 models, and now there are over 110 electric vehicle models that you can choose from, with probably double that many promised over the next 2 years. Right. So the automakers who said, we can't do this, this is too expensive, we don't know how to do this, please don't make us do this, have now realized that, and it's mostly China and it's mostly the Europe that we have to thank, because they went all in and said, we're doing this. And if you want to compete in our market, fine, but we're going 100% electric. And so they kind of had to figure it out. And they did, but for the job creation side of things, there's, to the earlier question, upstream or raw materials, this is the rare earth metals are a constant focus right now. Battery production is a big focus. You see some issues coming up, but from my perspective, things are going remarkably smoothly with the automakers in this process, given that they've only been at it for 18 months in any serious way. But midstream is the manufacture of parts and vehicle-specific components and putting those components into completed vehicles. And then we have all of the folks that sell vehicles, lease vehicles, and distribute them, that we have to account for. And you can see that there may be some employment shifts in this space, and we're going to account for some of them, but they're not really huge. There are going to be some changes in the occupational mix of automakers, but we're not expecting radical changes really in how things happen, except in terms of some of the materials that they need. But the workforce needs, yes, there's some retooling, but a bumper is a bumper, a wheel is a wheel. You're not having the engine components, but you do have batteries now to deal with. The other thing that'll be quite different is in terms of gas stations, auto repair shops. That's where you're going to lose a lot of jobs, because the electric vehicles require so much less maintenance. They have fewer moving parts. There's just a lot less to break typically at this point. Questions? Yeah.
There was recently an article in the Times that speculated that the actual, I guess, in just the assembly component of EVs would require half the labor.
Yeah.
I don't know, it seems
Yeah.
to not be constant with what you were saying, but I can see it.
Well,
There's just fewer parts.
I was trying to say there wasn't going to be a radical skill mismatch. I do think that if you don't have, I mean, engines are complicated. Batteries might be complicated from a chemistry perspective, but from an assembly and manufacturing perspective, they're not that complicated. And if you look at where we are, we're expecting electric vehicle prices before rebates to be in line with fossil fuel vehicles within the next 2 to 3 years. And they're expecting it to fall much more quickly than we thought it was going to fall 2 years ago. How is the price of electric vehicle going to fall? It's primarily going to fall because it requires less labor to produce than a combustion engine vehicle would. So that's sort of consistent. I mean, and the predictions in our model suggest that electric vehicles, we didn't know, right? This is 3 years ago. That's almost a decade in normal time. We predicted that electric vehicles wouldn't become cheaper than fossil fuel vehicles until 2030. And it looks like they're going to be cheaper within 2 to 3 years, even without the rebates. So companies are smart, they're figuring this out. And the main thing they're going to try and skip on is labor, because that's the most expensive component that they have to put into a vehicle. Transportation services. In California, where I was before I became dean of the LBJ school, they're going bonkers with, how do we need to electrify the goods movement. That's all the delivery trucks that come into your neighborhood to drop off your Amazon purchases, your groceries. That's regional and national heavy duty truck travel. There's a lot of micro mobility, things, scooters and bikes, single occupancy transit. That's your passenger vehicles. Lots and lots of those. Cars and trucks, mass passenger transit. So, again, this is private and public bus route. So that there's a broad suite of transportation services. At first, we thought this was going to be hard to model, but the more we thought about it, the more we realized that transportation services wasn't going to be an area that we needed to worry too much about. What's changing are the vehicles that are used. You still need, in most cases, drivers. We're not talking about automation here. We're talking about electrification. And so if the drivers are more or less staying the same, the only real thing that's going to change is maintenance is going to drop for the heavy duty yards and things like that. You're going to need fewer mechanics to repair these electric vehicles and the hydrogen trucks. And they're going to get cost savings from that. So you're not going to see me talk about transportation services much anymore. Did you have a question? No. Okay, so how do we do this? Well, we're taking 2019 as our baseline. We're looking at we're trying to first identify everyone that's employed in the current economy. And so we looked at how much transportation fuel is sold for fossil fuel vehicles, how much is sold for electric vehicles, how many vehicles that are sold are fossil fuel vehicles, how many are electric vehicles, and then what are the maintenance expenditures for those vehicles, right? And that gives us a baseline. To get to that baseline, we have to look at a lot of different industries. And then within each industry, have to look at the occupations, how many people are employed in each of the occupations within each of the industries. So, the paper that's behind this short presentation is 235 pages long. And it's just that one chapter in the final report, because there's just so much analysis that goes into establishing the baseline and then making clear what our assumptions are for what's going to change over the next 25 years. But this is just to kind of give you a sense of how many industries and how many occupations are kind of behind the scenes here. So I don't know if you're going to be interested in any of this, but to do this kind of work, you have to have a NAICS code, because that lets you take changes in expenditures and articulate how those changes in expenditures will go into either REMI or MPLAN, which is the kind of the regional economic model that tells you if you spend this much more on fuel in Austin, this is how many people are going to be employed, providing you with the fuel that you're demanding, right? Staffing the gas stations, moving the gas from the refineries to the gas stations, so on and so forth, right? So but we can sort of model over time changes in establishments, so think gas stations or charging stations, think refineries, think wells, well operations, estimated annual employment, estimated annual wages. And what the elected officials were really interested in is I'll get to you in just a second, who are the industries and the occupations that are going to be most impacted? And so we're gonna kind of feature those. One of the reasons for featuring those is the list of occupations is it's like 150 different occupations, right? And so it's a little overwhelming to just look at the list and even look at the list and changes in the list by year. You really want to know who's going to experience the most rapid change and who isn't. Yeah.
So my question is, what mathematical model have you used to predict the rate of diffusion of like EVs, given there's so much government incentives that can influence that?
Yeah.
How do you model that?
Yeah. It's a really great question. It's a super important question. A lot of my early work as a researcher was focused on answering that question. We completely dispense with that question by making a simple assumption here that there's a set of policies that between 2019 and 2045 will force consumers out of fossil fuel vehicles and into EVs. And I was very unhappy with that decision to sort of say that we're gonna take an engineering approach and we're just gonna force them out. And what you need to tell us is what's the impact of this forcing function. And from a policy perspective, I want to say, how are you gonna accomplish that forcing? How are you gonna accomplish that transition, right? Is the $7,500 tax credit that you guys are all eligible for now, if you purchase an electric vehicle, is that going to get us, what, is that going to increase sales by 2%, by 4% next year? To me, that's the important question in terms of policy effectiveness. That's not the question we're answering. So it's a great question. It's not the one we're focused on. Any other questions? All right. So I talked about spending patterns. Let me talk a little bit about this slide. And I'm going to talk you through this. So the internal combustion engine vehicles, the ICEV, I don't know if you guys can see this, it's that pink color at the top. That's the ICEV maintenance. And what you can see is starting in 2020, going on to 2045, expenditures to keep your fossil fuel vehicle up running. And you can see those declining over time. Fossil fuel sales is the sort of the burnt orange. You can see that declining over time. The reason it doesn't go to zero is you still have a used car market in fossil fuel vehicles in 2045, right? And we had to sort of, again, one of the other historic assumptions is how that used car market changes compositionally over time, right? And how many EVs are left and how many fossil fuels are left in that used car market. But you have to forecast spending patterns, or you can't make any of these assumptions. The blue are new vehicle sales of electric vehicles or hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. And then basically what you can see here is in this model, they're phasing out 2035 is the last year that you can purchase a fossil fuel vehicle in California. They moved, the policymakers couldn't make up their mind whether they wanted it to phase out entirely in 2040 or 2045. This particular scenario shows it's 2040. And this is, let me just make it clear on the y-axis, these are expenditures. So these are billions of dollars spent on maintaining all the fossil fuel cars, fossil fuel purchases, ZEV sales. There's, you can see in 2025 up top, new EV charging, and there are two components there. There's the charging, and then the green, which is also on top. Well, actually, this is the green that's electricity and hydrogen as a transportation fuel. So that's kind of, I mean, and you just look at it and you compare the size of these, and you can see that the electricity and hydrogen as a transportation fuel, you're not spending as much on it as you're spending on fossil fuel sales, right? Which is one of the reasons that it could be cost savings for us in the long term, even outside of the climate or the environmental benefits. And I guess the other thing that I would point out is there are a lot of people that, and I'll talk more about this, I'll kind of move through the slide more quickly now, but that new EV charging station and the new hydrogen refueling stations, there are a lot of early environmentalists who said, oh, we should do this because it's going to create a lot of new jobs. We don't see it creating a lot of new jobs. Like gas station construction would be today, it requires some labor, but it's not a lot of labor. You're not employing a ton of people there. So notice also the upper slope here. So remember I said that the economy is labor saving over time. And one of the things that you see aggregate expenditures on all transportation actually declining over time, right? Each of these stacks is basically everything that you as all the consumers in California, all the businesses in California would spend on transportation. That's fuel, vehicles, maintenance, right? That aggregate spending is actually declining over the next 25 years. If I were to show you the same graph with no EV transition, you would also see a decline, right? So that's an important thing. That's that labor productivity impact that you see. And it also means that consumers are better off because now, if their spending on transportation services declines, they have more money to spend on other things, right? Like education or healthcare that they want to. All right, so the next couple of slides are just drilling down now on each of these kind of areas. Maintenance, fossil fuel sales, vehicle sales, and sort of showing what that transition looks like. And so one of to figure out demand for fuel and the price of fuel every year, we had to look at fuel efficiency. And this just shows that especially the BEVs are much more efficient than are the ICEs. And we also have fuel cell vehicles for the heavy duty sector. So the impacts of transitioning to zero emission fuels, the gray are the fossil fuels. And again, this is annualized job years. So the way you think, if you're an economist and you're thinking about the economy and you're thinking about an industry, the question is how many full-time workers does that industry need each year? And how does that change year over year? So a job year is a full-time employee in an occupation in an industry, right? So the full-time equivalent is essentially one worker employed there, right? And this is in thousands. So we're predicting in our base year, lots of folks employed in the fossil fuel sector, and that's declining over time. You can see the employment in both the electricity and the hydrogen sector, and this is just focusing on the fuel supply chain. Right. So one of the things that should strike you is how many fewer people are employed in transportation fuels as a result of this transition. It's a lot. It's many, many fewer, right? I mean, we're at almost, I don't know what it is. We have to add these up, but it's
110 maybe.
Yeah, something like that. What are the most affected occupations? So in the fossil fuel sector, the retail folks that sit in the convenience store, sit in the gas station and wait for you to come in and use your debit card to refuel. Those folks, one of the big questions was what happens to those gas stations Do they turn into convenience stores with no gas? You know, what, we had to sort of make some assumptions about that. So we talked to the operators, and many of them said, look, if we drop below a certain level of sales for gasoline, we're just going to shut the whole thing down. You know, because we can't compete with some of the convenience store rivals that would come in. It's really gasoline that's sort of making the difference. So convenience store operators, gas station operators, drivers are the other folks that are going to lose their jobs. These are not just the truck drivers that are moving oil and gas around to the refinery and then from the refineries out to the gas stations, but there are all the other vehicle operators, fleet operators, or fleet workers who are needed to support the fossil fuel sector. You know, and then you get into a set of occupations that, I mean, none of these occupations are that exciting. And you kind of have to dig into kind of what's really causing the change in occupation. But a lot of this is just prepping sites for extraction, you know, building new gas stations, repairing existing gas stations, selling vehicles, right? This is just selling fossil fuel vehicles. And then supervisors of sales workers, right? I mean, and one of the things you want to ask yourself is how much do we care that these folks in these occupations are going to have to shift? How unique are the skills? Are they going to be able to find other jobs? Those are the kinds of questions that come up for the just transition. For electricity, it's all about expanding generation, transmission, and distribution, and building charging stations. So the construction workers are going to be the ones that will be more in demand. There'll be, again, a growth, and this is all relative to the existing baseline in the electricity sector of folks that work on installation, maintenance, and repair, engineers, good for you guys. And there's going to be more, apparently the prediction is there'll be more sort of middle and upper management, right, in these utilities and the companies. And then hydrogen, you see sort of a similar set of impacts, right? So, yeah, you know, this is what they wanted to know, kind of who's gonna lose and who's gonna gain. And then we have to ask the question politically, how much do these impacts matter? And what would you do? You know, I think the people that are operating in unions or trades, they're going to be the ones that politically are going to say, well, can you help us retrain our workers? Can you help our workers find other work? And so there might be the need to think about the policies that are going to support those guys. All right, I've talked a little bit about the ZEV fueling infrastructure costs. There hasn't been a lot of work on this done, and we kind of had to dig in ourselves. And you know, you remember that I said you have to know how much you're going to spend, both households and businesses and society overall, to kind of figure out what the employment impacts are going to be. And there are all of these different kinds of charging infrastructure. There's level 1 at the home, level 2 at the home. There's level 2 public and workplace charging, and then there's kind of level 3, more high-powered charging. My guess is that, you know, these costs are going to drop dramatically over time as we get better at installing Tesla-type recharging stations. The hydrogen charging stations are incredibly expensive right now, incredibly expensive. It's mostly because the hydrogen is under a lot of pressure, and it requires a fair amount of infrastructure there. Again, I don't know what's going to happen with hydrogen, right? It's really hard to know. But if that becomes an area where we double down and we really want to become good at that, I think that those costs will obviously decline too. So the thing we had to do was figure out the annual installation rates for charging stations if we're going to meet this demand in California. as electric vehicles are purchased, one of the hardest things to know is how many charging stations do you actually need for the vehicles, right? And I, as an early adopter, was always of the view that we were overestimating how much public charging was going to be needed. That the prediction that I made in 2013, 2015 is that someday we'd see electric vehicle ranges of 200, 300 miles. And that's exactly what we have today. And the longer the range, the less likely it is you're going to need to use a public charger. It's more cost effective to charge at home overnight. All the pricing on the public chargers, Tesla chargers, charge point chargers are 3 to 4 times what you would pay at home. So there's a strong reason that you'd want to charge at home. But anyway, we had to make an assumption about how much people are going to spend on level 1 home charging over time, level 2, which is quicker, and then workplace charging, and then high power charging. We made those predictions. We're pretty confident that as confident as you can be that they're reasonable. Only time will tell. But I think what we saw is that there is going to be a spike in the build out of this infrastructure, but that spike is going to decline pretty significantly. Once these stations are built, it's very easy to update the charging technology because what you're mostly building is a concrete pad, and you're running a circuit that's going to allow you to distribute a lot of electricity from that point, and then you can replace the charging equipment anytime you want, right? And there's been a lot of innovation in a very short period of time there. It is the place where most of the job creation for electric vehicles is happening. Charging stations are where it's happening. It's just kind of going back to, let's see. How do I go back?
Go to the keyboard.
Oh, good. The keyboard, yeah. Let's see, if you go back here, and the light blue is the spending on charging stations, right? I mean, the purple, the teal, whatever that color is. It's not huge. It's not as big as people, I think, thought it was going to be. All right. So I'm almost done. And so you can see, again, I don't find this super interesting, but this was the question that was asked. What are the most impacted occupations? Right here they are. So with that, I'll wrap up and see what kind of questions you guys have for me.
All right, thank you. Maybe I'll ask one online here. You had first already. One of these is perhaps an expansion of this, given you said these are not the types of studies that are fun for economists. But
Yeah.
if you were to form another study, would this be an interesting one? The question is regarding is the electric vehicle market, they're using this term here, something like a Trojan horse against jobs and workers in the sense of going automated. People are envisioning having automated driving, instead of human drivers, and then you're kind of analyzing one step towards that potential future of automated driving and what's the jobs impact of automated driving. Do you have any thoughts on? Well, maybe is that probably an interesting question for politicians in the same way this one is, but do you know anything about that, or do you have any thoughts?
Well,
I
I do think that as all the big automakers have to redesign their assembly plants, that they're going to look for, every time they do this, we've seen this, right? Every time they do this, they look for labor saving automation. So why wouldn't they do that this time? So every 10 years, you see the automakers, every time they build a new plant of any type, for any reason, they are looking for labor saving automation. So the answer is,
but even in the vehicle, this is drivers. I think they're implying like drivers, autonomous vehicles.
I don't think there's any reason to suspect that electric vehicles are more likely to be automated than gas-fired vehicles. I don't think there's any reason to expect that. Yeah.
So my question is, most of the EV load aggregators that would come into business in the next upcoming few decades, their first perspective is to optimally use the resources, the charging infrastructure, and they would definitely go for level 3 charges because faster and you can earn more profits. What is that conflict with the idea of people charging their cars at home at level 1 charges, and what's the comment about that?
So I think that the one thing I might disagree with in your characterization is that the level 3 is what's going to be the most profitable. I don't think that we have figured out how to make those DC fast chargers profitable. Even Tesla currently is losing money on those, and they're encouraging at-home charging. It seems like it's needed to support driving behavior and driving needs, but, and I don't know how much you've ever looked into utility price structures, but basically the more power you draw instantaneously off the grid, the bigger your demand charge is. And so right now, what are called the demand charge components for these high-powered charging stations are killing the kind of cost effectiveness of electric delivery for DC fast chargers. Home chargers, you know, it's 16 cents a kilowatt hour, super cheap. So if it would be nice if the DC fast chargers could be profitable and something that were cost effective, but right now we don't know how to do that technologically.
Hi, so my understanding is that Mexico is like a major manufacturer of passenger vehicles for the US. So I was curious if there's, you know, with the rise of like Tesla, if there's kind of a potential for more onshoring of like car manufacturing in the US, or if you think that like Mexico will take on a lot of this EV, or like how USMCA will impact that.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's actually very tied up in the tax credit policy that was just decided last week or the week before. So if you want that $7,500 tax credit, it's going to have to be from an American-made electric vehicle, which would include Canada and Mexico, in my understanding. So that the nearshoring incentives there are, and the onshoring incentives are super strong. $7,500, you know, is going to be 12% of the cost of the average electric vehicle today. So that's a pretty, that's a bigger incentive than any of the states are offering. So it's something you want, if you're an automaker, you want to be able to offer it to your consumers. So the incentives for onshoring and nearshoring are really strong. Yeah.
It seems like from a jobs perspective that the like auto repair and gas station is like the greatest risk of loss. The middle manager probably at the greatest advantage. So where exactly, what is the driving force behind political opposition to EV that's still pretty strong and like larger conservative?
Well, part of it is tradition, right? I mean, here, I don't need to tell you guys here in Texas and even in California, oil and gas extraction, development, refining, it's something, Alaska, you know, those are economies where these jobs are, they're good paying jobs. They're a relatively large percentage of employment in areas with very low population to begin with. And so they're jobs in places that mean a lot, even though the total number of jobs are very low, right? So in California, I think the oil and gas extraction job loss was on the order of, I want to say 8,700 jobs a year. So that's what the oil and gas industry would lose. But I don't know what the numbers are in Texas. I don't know how many workers are directly employed in oil and gas extraction. I'm guessing it's many fewer than you would guess initially, because it's, again, it's super capital intensive, right?
Some more, a couple other questions online. Let me go to one online and here. Maybe I'll go to this first one. It was asked early in the presentation. This is sort of about job creation studies in general. How do people use them? Are there instances where a state relaxes a universal standard regulations to encourage job creation for a specific industry because of a job creation study? Like, they're using the term to relax as a standard. I don't know. Okay. But do people use a job creation study to justify something they're already gonna do? Or did they do as a job creation study to inform what they should, make? Or maybe a different way of phrasing it? But like in
Yeah.
California say, well, we're doing EVs. Maybe I just like a little information about how this is impacted, but I'm gonna do the EVs anyway.
It's an interesting question. I mean, imagine lowering a product quality standard. High product quality standards, let's say for food. You know, take organic foods, right? They make the organic food more expensive. Right, so that's that high price sort of means people don't demand as much of them as you might wish that they did. If you lower that product quality standard, you're going to lower the cost of supplying the good, and in equilibrium, you're probably going to sell more of it. But I'm still not sure. So you're going to sell more of it. Maybe that means there are going to be positive labor impacts. That follows. Can I think of an example of that? No. But it doesn't mean that there aren't some examples. I just haven't thought carefully about it. It would be an unusual thing to do, right? I mean, it's kind of like allowing child labor, right? Yes, allowing child labor increases aggregate employment, right? But that's the kind of move you'd be making.
Oh, I like that. That's a good hack to the example of going back to job labor. I think, yeah, but I'm not for it. If you say to that.
Yeah, it was really interesting. And I've done these sorts of studies, and I'm sort of in awe of how difficult and challenging it was to sectorize and understand these things and generate inputs for the model and so on and so forth. But I'm just curious, what would it look like to spend another however many years to try to look at the externality effects or benefits from this transition?
Of what externalities are you focused on?
Well, I mean, you know, obviously the transition is going to dramatically, substantially reduce GHG, but with transition buses, I mean, these things have big health effects.
Yeah.
Have big, and I'm not saying, I was just curious of how you could maybe contemplate handling that, layering on top of these impacts.
Well, so the most obvious metrics used would be to move away from employment, although there could be some employment effects associated with those externalities, right? People might work longer, they don't have respiratory diseases or asthma or heart disease. Heart disease is actually the #1 health impact of poor air quality, right? It's not even respiratory diseases. But the metric you probably most care about is the avoided lost life years. The avoided lost life years. So health economists who study changes in impacts look at how much longer would you get to live on average for a population of folks if you implement this environmental health improvement right through a policy. And then if you fail to implement it, what are the lost life years that are associated with that, right? So you could that, and the public health schools are doing this kind of thing. I think you could find, I know for California, they've estimated reduced cases of asthma, lost life years, the value of statistical life avoided, things like that. Those estimates exist, and EPA has done it for the Clean Air Act amendments. For the country as a whole, a rough estimate, because they're required by Congress to do that. But all the externalities, I don't think anybody's done that for the transportation sector.
I have one more question on mine that I'm going to ask, and then we'll wrap it up there. So I'll just kind of read it here. One way of interpreting your study is an estimate of the labor elasticity of transportation electrification. This is from an economist. So other technologies are evolve and change at the same time as you apply sort of labor productivity types of things. So what is your sense of the cross technology labor elasticity? Put another way, how would your estimates be affected by allowing other technologies to develop during the study period? If this makes sense to you.
Yes. Well, I'm not going to be able to give the questioner an an estimated elasticity, as I'm sure they're not expecting an exact elasticity. But I think the interesting answer to their second question is, I mean, what we seem to be learning is that the more innovation you have in collateral sectors and technologies and components that go into the transportation sector in general. I mean, think about just I mean, you guys are all too young, but I mean, when I was in college, there was no GPS, right? There was nobody that was going to optimally route you. And just think about the efficiency gains that have come from optimal routing, right? In terms of fuel use, time. So I think the answer to their question is, I would expect that labor, these collateral innovations are going to affect labor demand by reducing it significantly. I don't know what the change in the elasticity would be. Of course not.
Okay, well, let's thank our speaker again, J.R. DeShazo. Public affairs.